Okay, this mic's gonna be much less quality, but is it at least not sped up and whatnot?
Yeah, it doesn't sound sped up or correctly.
Okay, okay, good. Yeah, so it's anyway, so how you doing, man? What you up to?
Pretty good. Just battling on the riff.
All right, yeah. So now I figure I'll just introduce myself right quick. So my name's Rocky. I study criminal justice at Sac State right now. I'm an undergrad. I want to go into law and then try to go for defense attorney and specialize and just focus on drug crime and defending people from drug crimes. I've just always been really interested in how like drugs work, the pharmacology of them, generally how we schedule them, why we regulate them, etc. And so, real quickly, I want to give a shout out to my brother Jason. He's in the hospital right now, but he was actually the one who recommended that I reach out to you. And so, just he's probably going to watch this when he gets out. So, just anyway, shout out him. But ultimately, yeah, there was a debate recently that you went on. I believe it was on Prime's debate panel, and essentially the topic of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine came up. And generally, from what I can tell of your like general drug ideas, like I've heard you talk about you were taking acid and stuff like that. Like I'm personally a big proponent of using acid as if it's done properly, like for introspection and things like that. But so generally speaking, when it came to the discussion of powder versus crack cocaine, it made me a little curious. Like, what is your general understanding of like how we schedule drugs and choose which schedule they go into and whatnot?
The scheduling seems to be entirely fucking arbitrary to me. I know that there are listed guidelines for things. So, for instance, I'm not going to remember all of these, but I believe that like a Schedule 1 drug is supposed to be something that has like a high propensity for abuse and no recognized medical use. And then Schedule 2, 3 have like different things for them, but
Yeah, and then the dependency rate and the general abuse level goes down as the schedule number goes up, and then also generally
yeah, it's
things
supposed to be clear.
like
Right, just want to be real clear. It's supposed to, but it doesn't seem to be the
yes.
case, right? Yeah,
Well, so
because
absolutely yes.
yeah.
Well, one of the things is obviously bad understanding and bad research on things like, for example, marijuana, not understanding that there is some sort of medical use to that. So it is arbitrary. And then another thing that is an issue is that they did mention that there is a media slant to how these drugs end up getting scheduled, and that is somewhat true. The issue that I always see is the media will always go to where the biggest story is and the most sensational thing is. So once we see a drug that is particularly affecting people and people are say dying from it, etc., they're going to focus heavily on that, and then there's going to be a large outcry on that specific drug to be regulated and whatnot, which usually regulating specific drugs honestly doesn't get to the root of the issue anyway, even if you are pro legislation on these drugs. Because I mean, one issue I don't know if you're aware of is like I personally when we talk about LSD, I have taken a lot of 1P LSD. So when you look at things like even the gray market area, you get these drugs that basically do the same thing, but nobody is ever prosecuted for them, or I mean, they could be prosecuted, but they have not been prosecuted for them yet, etc.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like designer drugs that aren't like regulated, even though they have produced similar effects and everything. But it's just because nobody's like heard of them yet, and they haven't been like specifically like called out in legislation yet. There's a lot
yeah,
of
there's not enough people using them for the media either to go and say, oh hey, there's this huge outpouring of it and whatnot. So yes, it is definitely quite arbitrary. But when we look specifically at crack versus powder cocaine, there's a couple things that I've kind of noticed, and when I've talked to people like professors about this, etc. The one thing that they say in regards to, and what I didn't hear a lot of on the debate panel, is the medicinal aspects of it. So one thing that we look at when it comes to the medicinal versus recreational, there's really two big aspects: is where it's created, and then the route of administration. So when we look at things like the Schedule 1 drugs, you'll see things that are made on the street. Heroin is typically made on the street. LSD usually isn't being synthesized by pharmacies unless it's for some niche research, etc., or it's in different countries and whatnot. You have meth, which is usually produced on the street. So usually where it's produced has a big impact on whether it's going to be in that Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. So for example, in Schedule 2, we see hydromorphone, which I believe is about 5 times stronger milligram per milligram than morphine, and so or heroin rather. And so heroin is Schedule 1, even though it's a less intense drug, it's not as strong, while hydromorphone buprenorphine is going to be Schedule 2. One of those reasonings is because it is made in, a lab in the pharmacy, etc. Well, heroin's made on the street. So besides that, the other thing we have is the route of administration, which is one thing that I could tell that you were kind of getting at a lot, that, people weren't trying to fully address. So when it comes to the route of administration, typically we've had a bias in the past of if it's something that's snorted or smoked, it's automatically more looked at as a recreational drug. Because typically speaking, when you smoke or snort something, it intensifies the euphoric aspects of it. And for people that don't know euphoric is just like a good feeling. Dysphoria is like, is a bad feeling or just a general unwell feeling. But generally speaking, when it comes to snorting it or smoking it, it intensifies the actual high aspect of it, and then it lessens the duration of action. And so typically when you're seeing somebody who is snorting something or smoking it, they're doing that in order to usually get a more intense high. Now, we do see these days that, marijuana can have very positive aspects medicinally, even through the smoking aspects of it. But even when it comes to that, doctors will usually recommend that you still eat edibles or you do something besides smoking, as there are the harmful side effects generally of smoking. And so, when people hear that, they'll say, okay, well, crack, you smoke that. And then, cocaine, you snort that. Now, that is the case for recreational use. However, there isn't really much of a medicinal use that you can use in any way when it comes to crack. When it comes to cocaine, you can apply it as a local anesthetic. So when we look at how it's used medicinally, it's not snorted, meaning that it is looked at as less recreational and more medicinal. And so
Can
obviously,
I, just as a question on that, that was true in the past, but do we still use cocaine as a local anesthetic?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay,
no, absolutely not. So that's the thing is when we look at these things, like for example, also methamphetamine, I do believe, typically speaking, in the past was used sometimes for, even weight loss or, ADHD, various things. But now we have other lesser intense drugs that don't necessarily harm the brain every time you take it, that we can use for ADHD, like, Adderall, etc. So nowadays we have it's the same thing for antidepressants as well. Like you have the old school ones like trazodone, etc. But now we have much more efficient and better ones that don't have as many side effects and whatnot. So no, we no longer use cocaine for it. For any type of really medical use, but because there is the potential medical use for it, they've still left it on that schedule. Now, a lot of people will kind of disagree with that, and I do too. But ultimately, when it comes to why these things are scheduled separately, that is one thing that I don't see addressed very often. Is that there was a history of medical use with cocaine for a period of time.
Sure.
While crack, there isn't really any sort of way that you can utilize it in more of a medicinal way. And then the other thing that I kind of heard you touch upon was the idea that cutting the drugs can make them more addictive. To a certain extent, I would agree. Oh, and then also, actually, let me go ahead and get another point. So the idea that crack and cocaine are pharmacologically the same thing, you didn't agree with that during the debate, but do you agree with that now, or do you still think that they're separate pharmacologically?
Like, they have the same, like, fundamental chemical, but the way that they interact with the body is different because of the route of administration, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So they are absolutely the exact same chemical, but when you go ahead and you smoke crack, the actual euphoric effects are a pretty quick rush, where it's like 15 to 45 seconds is that initial rush, and it tapers off from there. If you go ahead and you snort cocaine, it will typically take about 4 to 5 minutes to fully hit, and then there's a trail off up until about 30 minutes after taking the initial dose. So you're dosing much less compulsively when it comes to cocaine comparatively to crack, because with crack, you're constantly having to redose in order to keep that high going. So people will always mention that, oh, well, crack is cheaper, and this may be the case, but you're typically going to be smoking much more in a shorter period of time because you're not going to have, that length of high that you really want.
Sure.
And then also, of course, the issue with crack as well, the way that I always describe it to people is the effect on the body is basically just a really euphoric panic attack. So, essentially your adrenaline goes through the roof, you're very you get jittery, kind of paranoid, etc., but you also have this very intense euphoric feeling, which makes you want to go ahead and do it again and whatnot. But so typically, the effects of, the route of administration when smoking it, since it does condense it down so much, and cocaine is already a pretty intense drug, it condenses it down so much that it causes some of these negative effects much quicker. So we see paranoia and and again, the compulsive redosing much more heavily in crack than you do in cocaine. So with cocaine, even if you stay up for 24 hours, you're going to be off, you're going to be groggy, you're going to be etc. But typically, you're not going to show the same paranoia level as if you were staying up 24 hours off of crack instead. So ultimately, the route of administration, due to that condensing it down and having to take so much of it, definitely causes it to have more of a negative effect. And also, that's like that people kind of go ahead and they talk about the societal aspects of it, and that is important, but I think it's more important to look at how it affects the individual, because then you can just obviously see, well, how that's going to then affect the rest of the people. I mean, if you're having somebody who's having to smoke large amounts of crack, etc., I mean, once they run out, they're going to be paranoid, etc., and they're still going to be chasing that high, so they're going to be much more likely to have this erratic behavior than somebody who is just simply coming off of a 6-hour coke binge and whatnot. So yes, the route of administration is drastically different. And one thing that I actually really liked that you did mention in the debate was, rectal administration. So when you take a lot of people in colleges for a while there, supposedly were taking tampons or taking other things, soaking them in alcohol, and then shoving them up their rectum in order to, get the most out of the alcohol.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, there's essentially, something in your rectum that allows it to go straight to the bloodstream. It's a very bioavailable in there. And so when you have something that gets it straight into the bloodstream, is very bioavailable, etc., it's going to have a much more intense effect. And then also, you don't have the second bypass and whatnot when you're going through the liver that you necessarily would and when you're going and taking pills or something along those lines. So generally speaking, that's the main things I had to say on the crack versus powder cocaine. Beyond that, I would say, that was what I was going to mention, the cutting of drugs. So when you mentioned the cutting of drugs, you were like, the cutting drugs can make them more addictive potentially. That could potentially be true. When we look at things such as like crack, usually it's just diluted because of the baking soda and whatnot. But typically when we talk about laced drugs or cut drugs, you're going to have something like maybe fentanyl, and when you're looking to get Percocet. One thing people don't really realize is that yes, fentanyl is insanely strong, and so obviously because of that, they'll go to the micrograms or even picograms for carfentanil, and which is a much smaller unit than just regular milligrams, and so they'll put a lot less in there. But one thing people don't realize about something like fentanyl is it's a really shitty high. Essentially, it's one of the shortest acting opiates. I believe it lasts like 2 hours is the main effects of it. It's a really itchy drug. It's a really moderately dysphoric drug because of how strong it comes on and its just general duration of action. Mm-hmm. And so typically, if you're looking to get Percocet, which lasts 6 hours, and I mean, I've done almost every single drug that you could name besides PCP, or I haven't smoked crack either. But typically, if you're looking for Percocet and you get fentanyl, you're gonna be pretty pissed, and it's not gonna be something I would say that would be more addictive. The only time I could see maybe a cut making something more addictive is for Molly in particular, MDMA, because when you get Molly off the street, if you get something such as meth or maybe Ritalin or something else, you may have more of a compulsion to redose when you wouldn't necessarily have that if you were taking MDMA itself.
Sure. I don't know if I might have misspoke when I was speaking. The point of cutting isn't necessarily that it will make it like more addicting, but more that there will be like other potential negative effects that'll happen as a result, right? That like if you're eating like pure MDMA, then the chances of you getting like fucked versus like getting some ecstasy that has been mixed with something that could be more harmful or whatever is the chance of like there being some really harmful thing happening there is probably higher for something that's been cut with something else. Although to be fair, like you could be sold pure MDMA, but they could have actually cut it with something else, and if you don't test it, you wouldn't know. So I mean,
yeah. No, absolutely, 100%. Like, so that makes perfect sense. That was actually the point that I was going to make. Is typically when you get a cut drug, it just makes it worse off. Like, for example, one time I was attempting to get MDMA, and it turned out to be pure methamphetamine, and I didn't test it ahead of time because I was a fucking idiot. And then I was up for 3 days straight. And also, one thing that people don't realize about meth is that it's actually a pretty terrible drug if you just swallow it. There's very little euphoria that comes with it, but the duration of action is so damn long. But so typically, when you want to take meth, you're gonna snort it, smoke it, something along those lines. But so yeah, when you try to get something like MDMA, if you're gonna get something cut, it's typically gonna be worse off than if you were to get the regular drug. So no, that makes total sense. That you cleared that up. But
sure, which makes sense because if it was a better drug, you wouldn't call it getting cut. It would just be a new drug. Like right? Like nobody says it like, oh, like I thought I had really good MDMA, but it was fucking cut with another upper. But well, no, that's just ecstasy because it's better. Well, or because some people prefer that experience to pure MDMA. saying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like you're not going to complain if you go to try to get like Vicodin, but you end up getting Percocet, which is 1.5 times stronger. You know what I mean? You're
Yeah,
going to be like,
exactly.
oh shit, well, like better for my money. So, yeah. Let me see here. Was there anything else here? Short duration actions, other two. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that was generally most of the things that I wanted to cover. Overall, yeah, I think that the conversation was pretty unproductive on that debate, but mostly because the other people just had no. I mean, especially I could see your frustration when the person said LSD was completely destructive and whatnot. I
Yeah,
was
because you
like,
can tell,
oh,
because people are just throwing out whatever random drug they've heard of, and then it's like really frustrating because a lot of these are like quite different from one another. It feels like I'm arguing with my like conservative parents who are just like, yeah.
oh yeah, no, same here. My parents had absolutely. Well, also a lot of people of the older generation I've noticed are kind of induced or introduced into that AA mentality, where there's this whole cult idea of like once you're addicted to something, you will always forever be addicted to something, and you can never touch any substance ever. And that's like a hard position to kind of reason people out of when you have this idea of drugs in your head and whatnot. So. Yeah. But yeah, okay, all right, yeah. That's I mean, that's pretty much all I wanted to go over, man. So yeah, if there's any thing in the future, I'll definitely hit you up. Or if there's anything about like drugs, etc., that you ever want to chat about, definitely just hit me up. Oh, you there?
Oh God. So I'm actually on the worst drug of all time, right now. Sorry.
You're
The
good.
yeah, no, I think I agree mostly with what you're saying. Yeah. Or obviously, I mean, I can't think of anything I disagree with. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I figured this wouldn't be much of a disagreement. Just figured maybe the audience might be a little interested and could clear some stuff up. So yeah, no, definitely. But I'll definitely hit you up in the future. And yeah, like I said, if there's ever anything about drugs or anything like that, definitely just hit me up.
Okay, cool. Have fun. Be careful. Stay safe.
All right, yep, see you.
I spaced out of my head to the depths of the universe. It's a spell or a chance just to open up a new